Hello and welcome to Radio 1. My name is Sharita and I will be your lecturer for this semester. So I come from a radio background. I've been in the industry for quite a while, and I also run my own company where we work with radio stations and different media platforms, and we come up with creative ideas. So I'm still involved in a day-to-day basis in the industry also. But my big passion is specifically for radio. And I think once the radio bug has bitten you, you will be in this industry forever. So it's my job to make sure that you understand how radio works and to get you to continue with this journey. So before we start, you'll see that my email address is on here. If ever you need to get a hold of me, you can simply send me an email, sharita@mediabeat.co.za. I will be creating a Telegrams group that will be posted on Call Campus. So please go and join that group. If you have any questions, you can also post it there. So for today, we're going to look at the radio landscape. So quite a lot that can be said about the radio landscape, but we'll be looking specifically at an introduction, at the evolution of South African radio specifically, and then we'll look at the different sectors. So there's the commercial radio sector, the public radio sector, and the community radio sector. So our industry is divided into three services. What are they? I literally just gave you the answers. So we have the public service radio sector, the commercial radio sector, and the community radio sector. Just so that you understand how it works, the campus radio stations, they are between 19 and 21. I think currently there are 19 that are on air. They fall under community radio stations because they are there to provide for their campus communities. So if we look broadly at radio, where did it start? How is it that we are here where we are today with regards to radio? Okay, it had to have started somewhere, and yes, it did. It's been in existence since the early 1900s, so for quite a while. In South Africa, the first radio broadcast took place in 1923. The first time anyone went on air was actually here in Joburg. It was the South African Railways in Joburg in December 1923. And this was followed by the Cape and Peninsula Broadcasting Association in Cape Town in September 1924. And after that, Durban followed with the Durban Organization in December 1924. So that's when everything started. And then it went on for a couple of years up until 1927, when the African Broadcast Corporation, or the ABC, was formed. And instead of the government taking ownership of these three stations, they were the responsibility of the ABC, so of the African Broadcasting Corporation. This was the first time anything like this was done. And as you can imagine, it might not have been that easy for these guys. And the ABC struggled financially. And in 1936, this company was dissolved. Okay, what happened was, in its place, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, so the SABC, was formed under the Act number 22. And the SABC bought all the ABC licenses and began to broadcast in 1936. So the SABC, as you know them today, started existing in 1936 already. So that went on for a couple of years. And then in 1943, they decided that we need different languages to broadcast on. And the SABC launched its first African language services in isiZulu, isiXhosa, and Sesotho. And today they have 19 publicly owned radio stations. I'm not sure if you're aware that they had that many, or if you know what they are. But today the SABC has SAFM, then they have RSG, which is in Afrikaans. They have Ukhozi in Zulu, Mhlobo Wenene, which is in Xhosa. Then there's Lesedi FM in Sotho, Tubela FM in Northern Sotho, Motsweding FM in Tswana, Palapala FM in Venda, Mungana Lonene FM in Tsonga, Ligwala Gwala FM in Swazi, Ikwekwezi FM, which is Southern Ndebele, True FM, which is in both English and Xhosa. And then there's Lotus FM, which is an English and Hindi radio station for the Indian community. And then there's XKFM. So that's in terms of public service radio stations. Then we also have Radio 2000. And then there's 5FM, Metro FM, and Good Hope FM. Okay, so those are all the stations that make up the SABC radio stations. Obviously, then from a television perspective, there's SABC 1, 2, and 3. So that's all those stations from 1936, where they bought over a couple of these, and SAFM being the first one in 1936, followed by RSG in 1937, up until the most recent one, which is XKFM, which was added in 2000. So that's the big overall background of all the SABC radio stations. So television only arrived in South Africa in 1976, meaning that for over 50 years, South Africans relied solely on radio stations for their news, their entertainment, and to a large extent, their education. Today, we're sitting in a situation where 90% of South Africans are still listening to the radio stations. So radio is still a very strong medium in South Africa. And our average time spent listening is more than 4 hours a day. So TSL stands for time spent listening. And 45% of listeners listen to about 20 hours of radio weekly. Okay, so that's a lot. That's a lot of radio listening. Think about yourself and how often you personally listen to radio, or how often your parents still listen to radio. If you get in a car, I'm sure you're listening to a radio station. So radio is a prolific and a powerful medium of communication, regardless of our economic status or regardless of geography. So it doesn't matter where you are. So currently in South Africa, there are over 300 licensed radio stations, and this is excluding the internet-based stations, okay? And there's about 30-odd internet radio stations, and that's growing because you currently don't need a radio license for it, but we'll chat about that later on. 22 of these radio stations are privately owned commercial radio stations that are run by business owners to deliver a profit. And then there's the 19 SABC radio stations that we mentioned, so SA's public broadcasters, and then 3 of those are commercial stations. When we look at the SABC and where their funding comes from, they are dependent on advertising, okay, advertising revenue, even though its only shareholder is the Minister of Communications. The SABC can also get some of its revenue through TV license fees, and a lot of people don't realize that if they pay their TV license, they're actually helping to support not only the SABC stations, but also all the SABC radio stations. So pay those license fees. But the SABC is not a state broadcaster. Okay, as I've said, the only shareholder is the Minister of Communications. So not a state broadcaster. Only 3% of its funds comes from the government. So majority of the funds comes from advertising. The rest of the radio stations in South Africa are known as the community radio stations. So they're self-funded, and many of them are non-profit organizations. So they're widely managed and staffed by volunteers. So where does it start? How does one start a radio station? Well, first and foremost, you need a license, okay? So you need a license that is granted by ICASA. If you have a mouse, okay, for your laptop, if you look at the back of your laptop, if you look at the box that your phone was in, if you have AirPods or earphones and you look on that, everything's got a label that says ICASA. Okay, ICASA is the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. They are in charge of the radio stations. And they are mandated to issue licenses to ensure universal service and access to everyone, to monitor the whole industry, to hear their disputes, to plan and control and manage the frequency spectrum, and to protect customers from unfair business practice. So what is frequency spectrum? Radio stations, in essence, get 2 separate licenses. The first is called a class license. That is the license that tells you what your name is and what FM you fall under, let's say 88.9 FM, whatever it might be, okay? Your class license will give you a list of requirements you need to adhere to. But then you also get what is called a spectrum license. Okay, spectrum license shows you your footprint in essence. It shows you how far and wide you are allowed to broadcast, because obviously everyone can't just broadcast wherever they want to, because then we would sit with a lot of radio stations overlapping each other. ICASA regulates this, okay? They monitor and regulate the frequency spectrum. So where on the frequency scale you can sit. And this is whether it's AM or whether it's FM. So as you can hear, ICASA does quite a lot in South Africa, and radio stations have what's called an ICASA licensing officer, and that's the officer that is in charge of a specific station to make sure that they are adhering to all their rules and that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing in essence, okay? So in 2017, ICASA ceased the issuing of new licenses due to a lack of available frequency on the analog broadcast spectrum. There's been a lot of speculation that ICASA has said that you can now apply for a license once again. What they did in October of 2020 is that they opened up applications for people, inviting people who want to pre-register for community sound broadcasting service licenses. So if you want to start a community radio station, you could have started applying for a license at the end of 2020. As of yet, however, we have not heard back from what is happening with regards to those, and we're not quite sure where on the spectrum they want to place these, though. So there's currently a big discussion going on with regards to ICASA and with regards to community licenses, and with regards to whether we will be getting more community radio station licenses. There's also been a new commercial radio station that's popped up called Star FM. And they literally opened their doors on the 1st of July here in Johannesburg. And if you go and have a look at the presenters that's on Star FM, it's a lot of people that have previously been in the industry for quite a while, that's quite well known. So they've started establishing themselves from the start. Currently, ICASA is planning to implement a new digital broadcast technology. This is something that they're busy testing at the moment. They've been looking into it for the past couple of years. So there's the new digital terrestrial television, which includes DAB, digital audio broadcasting, and digital radio mondial. There's a lot of speculation around DAB specifically about whether it's actually ever going to come into play in South Africa or whether it's not going to, because there's quite a big price attached to it, because South Africans will need government subsidized set-top boxes, STBs, for this to work. It's quite an expensive expedition for the government specifically, way more expensive than a normal radio. But what it will do is it will mean that a lot of frequency will be opening up on the frequency spectrum, because radio will no longer be analog, meaning that those can be used for a range of different things. And meaning that a lot more radio stations will have the opportunity to pop up. Currently, this is being tested. I mean, you can buy radio devices. I personally have one that can do both DAB and FM. So a couple of radio stations are already being tested on both of these. Okay, so it's not being switched off on the FM frequency. They're currently being used for both. So whether a station is owned by the government or not, South African radio stations operate on a commercial business principles and commercial operational practices. If we look at a radio station, what do we have? We have content. So a radio station's product is its content. That's what it sells. It can sell that content not only within its footprint, but also outside of that traditional footprint, if there's an interest to another market. So if, let's say, for instance, a Mauritian radio station wants some of our content, we can sell it to them. A lot of American radio stations syndicate their audio, okay? A very good example is Ryan Seacrest's show. The KFM used to syndicate Ryan Seacrest's show, being one of, I think, over 300 radio stations at that point that did it. Just like many commercial businesses, radio stations are dependent on consumers, in this case listeners, on customers or clients, in our case, advertisers or sponsors, donors or partners, stakeholders, in the case of state-owned enterprises, and then shareholders, in the case of privately or commercially owned radio stations. Can you name 5 commercial radio stations? I mentioned 3 of them earlier for you, and I just mentioned another one now. Any 5? Let's go through a couple of them. So there's Jacaranda FM, 5FM, KFM, 947, YFM, Algoa FM, Capricorn FM. There used to be Classic FM, which has now been bought over by Hot. So Hot is now officially a commercial radio station also. Gagazi FM, Good Hope FM, Heart FM, Metro FM. There's OFM, Power FM, Smile in Cape Town, True FM. So we have a wide range of commercial radio stations within South Africa, within our platform. Within South Africa, within our platform. I want you to see whether you can pick up which of the commercial radio stations these are.
Your word, valid and disclosure. Before this, Balavan TKZ, the soundtrack of me losing my way after matric was Halloween. I can tell you that for free, and it still makes me happy up until this very second of today.
Isn't it crazy how TKZ, excuse me, have been responsible for so many things?
I just thought that's how you guys used to say TKZ. We've just been, cool with it.
Go to our website, www.kfm.co.za, to find out more about the story that says that health officials are concerned about a possible 3rd wave of COVID-19.
Can I tell you, I'm such a failure. I really am. I really am. It's like if you're going to get in trouble, at least get in trouble for good things. Like you've done something cool.
Of all the Daft Punk songs, you chose the one that literally no one knows.
So for those who don't know how radio works, we don't pick the music that plays on radio. There's a whole people upstairs who do that, right? We're not allowed to chop and change and whatever. But I was like, oh, Daft Punk, they're separating. Let's play one of their songs. And I was going to play one more time. So I go into the system and I find one more time and I drag it across. But instead of dragging one more time, I drag whatever the nonsense this is. What just happened on the radio?
Of all the songs that could be a dedication to Daft Punk breaking up YouTube.
Okay, I'm going to stop that right there. So you should be recognizing some of these voices and noticing that some of these presenters have moved to other stations. That kind of things happen in radio a lot, okay, so very frequently. So that's 2 commercial radio stations, Kai FM and 5FM.
And Rihanna, Love the Way You Lie. Hiccup before that with Valley. 5 minutes and about 45 seconds away from 7 o'clock. This Hump Day with Darren, Kerry and Sky right here on East Coast Radio. Beautiful, and it's going to get hot today. Now listen. This Auto General thing that we're doing with East Coast Radio, it is a double whammy win-win. You get to find out if your friends are really, really your friends. You put them to the test, and the reward is that you get to win your share of 50,000 Rand. It's our Call a Friend competition.
We are asking you to find that friend that you can trust unconditionally. So, yes.
Okay, so that was the 3rd one. That was East Coast Radio, as you heard. So why do commercial radio stations exist? They exist to deliver a profit. That's it, okay? It's the same as any business. Why does a business exist? It exists to make a profit to its shareholders. So universal business principles are applied to commercial radio stations. Radio is a highly competitive space, and stations are fighting for time with their listeners, okay, with other radio stations. So they need to have a clearly defined offering designed to attract and sustain their listeners. I can't simply attract you once. I need to make sure that you're going to come back and listen for more. Because that way I have the best, most desirable product to take to advertisers and to get them to buy into so that I can make a profit. So when we refer to deregulation, we mean the government withdrawal of a number of rules and laws that have been imposed on a particular sector of the industry. So that government may have had a number of reasons to regulate a particular industry in the past, but has chosen to shift to a less regulated environment in terms of the media, specifically to promote healthy competition and growth, okay? So deregulation also establishes a more credible image of the industry in the minds of the citizens. Liberalization then refers to when the government relaxes its laws and policies in order to reflect a more free market approach to commerce and trade. In the case of media, this involves the government allowing a wider range of parties to apply for radio station licenses and enabling applicants to obtain licenses for a greater variety of content formats. So this is what we sit with. So in South Africa, we went through both deregulation and liberalization. Okay, and we've been doing this since the 1990s. And since then, the number of radio stations operating under a commercial license has risen steadily. So this started happening from 2006 with the privatization of 6 radio stations that was owned and operated by the SABC. And those are 947, Jacaranda, East Coast Radio, KFM, OFM, and Algoa FM. With regards to the public sector, there are 3 major contenders within South Africa's commercial radio space, and they are Kagiso Media, Prime Media, and African Media Entertainment, so AME. The SABC operates 3 commercially designed radio stations, and those are 5FM, Metro, and Good Hope FM. So if we briefly look at the public radio stations in South Africa, these are specifically, as I've mentioned, Ikwekwezi FM, Ligwala Gwala FM, Lotus FM, Lesedi, Mongana Lonene, Motsweding, Palapala, Radio 2000, RSG, SAFM, Tubela FM. Why do they exist? 11 of these exist so that we can have 1 radio station in every language. The rest are there out of a need for specific cultural reasons, to make sure that the whole South Africa is covered, that there's a radio station for anyone to be able to listen to, that the whole South Africa is covered, and that there's a radio station for anyone to be able to listen to. So again, all the different radio stations, as well as what they do. And public radio in South Africa is the exclusive territory of the SABC. And over 70% of these stations' funding comes from advertising, okay? Why do community radio stations exist? Community radio stations are there for their specific community. A community radio station is a voice for the voiceless, in essence, okay? It's a training ground for new radio presenters coming in. It's an opportunity for you to be upskilled. Within South Africa, the community radio stations must be diverse. They need to be present in all languages and cultural groups, okay? Whether it's religious, whether it's for students, whether it's specifically aimed at women, whatever it is. And in 2017, we had 260 community radio stations in South Africa. We have a couple more at the moment, but they change quite often and they're not always on air. So it's it's difficult to always give an exact number of radio stations, of community radio stations operating within South Africa. Some of them do extremely well, and some of them are run on the same principles as commercial radio stations. But some of them have massive financial challenges and they can't always be on air. Some of them are even broadcasting out of a house, okay? It's out of someone's bedroom. So we sit with a lot of different types of community radio stations, which is quite similar to South Africa on the whole, okay? So we have community radio stations within most of the communities, and I'm sure you have specific community radio stations to which you listen to. I know I have, because they are there to target certain communities, certain people, certain cultures and groups, okay? Community radio stations cultivate loyal listeners. People who tend to listen to these stations tend to be extremely loyal and tend to listen to these stations for years, unless they move or whatever might happen, okay? But like I've said, there are serious challenges for these stations. Not all of them, but for some of them. So either they have very small footprints because they have very weak transmitters. But a big one is that they're competing against SABC and commercial radio stations, okay? And advertisers, unfortunately, tend to look at reach, and the reach sits with the national radio stations or the big regional radio stations. So the community radio stations tend to be second choice when it comes to a lot of the advertisers. Also, something that they struggle with is training. So it's a case of who trains the community radio stations, and then what happens when these presenters or technicians or producers become really well, they exceed in their jobs, they get picked up by the commercial radio stations who can afford to pay them or at least pay them more. And then the whole thing starts over and over again, okay? So community radio stations are literally seen as a training ground also, especially campus radio stations. In campus stations, you start off as a student, they train you up in all facets of radio, similar to what I'm doing with you right now. And then as you become better at what it is and more equipped, you might move on to a bigger community radio station, or you might move on to a commercial radio station or a public broadcaster. So community radio stations also tend to have less listeners, which means less ads, which means less money. Okay, so they are dependent on funding, whether it is from a government institution, whether it is from universities, whether it is from the MDDA in South Africa, who is the Media Development and Diversity Agency for South Africa, or whether it's from other donors or fundraisers. They do need money. On the other hand, they are not run like a commercial radio station. So community radio stations are not supposed to be making a lot of money. Okay, they're not there to bring in money for shareholders. The money that comes into a community radio station should be put back into the community at the end of the day. Okay, whether it's through upskilling or more diversifying, or whether it's through community projects, which you have to do a lot of. There's a lot to be taken into consideration here. So as much as the RAM figures have not been updated, just out of curiosity's sake, if we look at the largest commercial radio stations in South Africa in 2018, it was Metro, Gagazi, and 947. The April 2019 to March 2020 stats, however, shows that it was Metro, Gagazi, and Jacaranda. So it's quite interesting just to see these moves. But that basically is it from me for today. It's quite a lot of information that I want you to digest in one go. Okay, so we'll continue in the next class. But I do have homework for you. And your homework is as follows. I want you to listen to an hour radio from a commercial radio station, from a community radio station, and from a PBS radio station. Okay. So the commercial radio station needs to form part of either Kagiso Media, Prime Media, or AME, and then any community and any PBS station. Fill in a media log to keep track of your listening. So I want you to track what you've listened to, okay, and actively participate. Don't just passively listen to it. And then I want you to go to page 15 in your textbook and complete activity 1A, questions 1, 2, and 3. And that reads, compare the difference between community and public radio with regard to ownership, audience, and funding. Number 2, they discuss the arguments put forth in example 1A and against the ruling that 90% of music played on air must be local music. Motivate your position both for and against. And number 3, visit the BRC's website. Okay, they give you the link there. And complete the following table by filling in the listenership sizes of the stations listed. Then look up each radio station's geographic footprint and compare and contrast where and how the listenership figures differ among the stations. So it's community, public, and commercial radio. The stations, from a community perspective, Josie FM, public Ukhozi FM, and commercial YFM. Okay. And then what you need to do is give us the listenership figures and the geographic footprint of these 3 radio stations. And there's a specific reason that we've chosen these 3 stations, okay? We'll chat about that in the next class. Along with that, in the next lesson, you will learn about digital radio and radio outside of South Africa. But for now, however, that is it for today. And I'm going to say goodbye up until next time. Bye.